Hi folks, this is International Master Kostya Kavutskiy, and today I'll be doing a video on the Greek gift sacrifice. Now this is one of the more famous sacrificial tactical ideas in chess, so I'm sure most of you have already seen or heard about this idea before. So what I'll do is I'll quickly introduce what the Greek gift sacrifice looks like, and then I'll show you a couple variations or a couple different patterns to look for in order to find, let's say, more unusual circumstances of this kind of sacrifice. The first game I wanted to show here is just a classic example of this. This is played by one of the first chess masters of all time, Gioacchino Greco, back in 1620. And here with white, he plays h4, already setting up a potential sacrifice on h7. Black takes the bait and castles, and here comes white's idea. He plays e5, and the first point I want to make is that this e5 pawn is very common for these kinds of sacrifices because it displaces the knight on f6, which is usually guarding the h7 pawn and allows for the sacrifice to take place. Black played knight to d5, and here we go. White is already ready to sacrifice on h7 with the bishop. This draws the black king out and opens the king up for the rest of white's pieces to come in and deliver a decisive attack. Knight g5 check is the typical follow-up, but you'll see in some cases that sometimes it suits white in order to bring the queen in first, but it really depends on the concrete details of the position. In most cases, the knight is coming to g5. And here black has a choice, but all roads basically lead to mate. If the king goes back to g8, white plays queen to h5, and queen h7 check mate is on the agenda. If black takes the knight, white of course takes with the h-pawn, opens up the rook on the h-file, and mate along the h-file is basically unavoidable. Typically speaking, it is a better defense for black to come out to g6, which we'll look at in just a moment. In this game, black took on g5, and here we again see the point of white playing h4 in this position in order to open up the rook on the h-file. And after king to g8, queen h5, we get the same position as before. And after f5, white played g6 to lock the king in and delivered mate very soon. If the king had tried to run via g6, typically speaking, white will get a powerful attack in these cases because the king is usually lacking any serious escape squares, and white's pieces are able to deliver checkmate, with the queen usually playing the main role. Here white has a forced mate after queen h5, king f5, queen h3. If black goes back to g6, it's queen h7 mate. If the king goes to e4, in this case we have queen d3 mate, but as you can imagine, there are all kinds of different checkmates in these kinds of positions available. Once the king starts running towards the center of the board, it's usually a very, very dangerous venture. Earlier, if the king had gone to g6, this is a common way for black to try and defend, and usually white here has a number of options of continuing the attack. In this case, almost all of them are good, but in normal cases where black has more defensive resources, you typically do have to be very precise in terms of how you continue the attack. In this case, queen d3 check is immediately winning. If the king goes to the h-file, then the queen will show up on h7 with devastating effect. And if black plays f5, white often has e takes f6 en passant. Keep in mind that the knight on g5 is protected, so black has to play king takes f6, and white has a winning attack after queen f3 check, for example, h5, king h6, and queen e4, threatening queen h7 mate, as well as a number of discoveries by the knight thanks to this bishop sitting on c1. So white is just completely winning there. Other options for white include to advance the pawn to h5. This is a very typical motive, because if the king ever goes to h6, white might not get immediate mate, but in view of the discovery along this diagonal, white is almost always going to have some knight discovery to win a lot of material. In many cases where the Greek gift sacrifice is working, it is often supported by this bishop on c1, or at least on this diagonal, not only supporting the knight, but controlling all of these dark squares, and this often contributes to the attack. So those are just a few of the factors to look for, and now I want to show you guys some variations on this sacrifice so you know what other patterns to look for when trying to calculate this thing out. Our next example here comes from the game Spassky Geller from 1965. And here Spassky plays the classic Greek gift, bishop takes h7. But this is quite different because white does not have the g5 square available for the knight, so it's not exactly working in the exact same way. Black took on h7, and here comes Spassky's idea is to push the pawn forward with check and open up the g5 square for the knight. In the game, black played king to g8, which basically transposes if black had played f takes g6. King g6 is too dangerous after queen d3 check. White is just going to have a winning attack here. So king g8 was played. White brought in the knight with knight to g5, f takes g6, and queen f3. So the sacrifice is a little bit different because it's moving a little bit slower than usual. But after queen f3, white is starting not only queen f7 check, but also just a simple queen h3 followed by queen h7 mate. And this is very difficult for black to defend against because the bishop on f8 is blocking the king's escape route. And black basically has no defense. In the game, he decided to play queen takes g5 and try to survive with two pieces versus the queen, but of course this was a losing venture. So this was a basic variation of this kind of sacrifice where white was able to establish the strong knight on g5 and basically ensnare black's king in this mating net in order to bring the queen in. So keep in mind that when you're playing bishop takes h7, the attack doesn't necessarily need to crash through immediately. If your pieces are truly dominant, a lot of times your opponent won't have a defense anyway. In this case, white also has this e5 pawn that can be pushed to e6 at the opportune moment. Our last game here features Grandmaster Sergey Karjakin playing white. This is back from 1988. And here he opts for, once again, bishop takes h7. And I wanted to include sacrifices here that don't necessarily contain a knight coming to g5 because the bishop takes h7 sacrifice is often followed up with some kind of kingside attack. And it's not always required that you need a knight in order for this attack to succeed. Here, white's idea after king takes h7 was to play queen h5 check, king to g8, and now a very strong move, bishop f6. And this was the key follow-up that white had to calculate before going for this. And this opens up a number of threats, including queen to g5, as well as rook to g5. And basically, black's king is about to get mated on the dark squares. If black plays g takes f6, white uses the rook on b5 and plays queen g4 check, forcing the king over to the h-file and rook h5 mate. This was the point of bishop f6 to try and open up the g-file and set up this g and h-file mate with the queen and rook. In the game, black played bishop h2 check, so he did not take on f6, king to h1, and queen d6. In fact, black still had a defense here. This was found by the computer, of course. And that was the move queen to f4 would apparently keep the game going. Now white's best is to play bishop takes g7, opening up the king even more. And after rook g5 check, king f6, queen h6 check, king e7, rook e5, king d7, and queen takes b6, white has remained a piece down, but black's king is in serious danger. The computer evaluates this position as equal, meaning black has some defense here, but to any human's eyes, it's clear that white would still have quite a powerful attack, and this would be quite difficult for black to defend. In the game, black played queen d6, and this loses to the same bishop takes g7 sacrifice, opening up the king to decisive effect. King takes g7 was played, rook g5 check, king f6, and now a really strong move, rook e1, sealing the fate of the king and controlling the e-file, meaning that this king is about to get mated. The threat is queen h6 mate, and black just doesn't have any defense. Rook f5 check is also followed by queen g4, and rook h5 is also a very dangerous threat. So black had to play queen e6 just to give up the queen and avoid mate, and white went on to win as the attack, continued from here. So that wraps up this lesson on the Greek gift sacrifice. Make sure to check out the exercises because they're most likely going to be quite challenging. I've included some puzzles that show some unusual resources in terms of the follow-up to bishop takes h7. And the reason is because it's easy to solve a problem when you know all the moves in advance, but if you have to look at the concrete details of the position, I think this is a more instructive feat in order to solve these problems in sort of unusual situations. So all the exercises will be featuring some form of the Greek gift sacrifice, but the follow-up will often be unique and quite difficult to find, so that'll be your task. All right, guys, take care, and until next time, this was International Master Kostya Kavutskiy.